We have with us Senator Tom Cotton, chairman of the committees that actually matter. Senator, how are you, sir?
I'm good, Mark. Thanks for having me on tonight.
It's a weird interview, I'm afraid. I'm just interested in your take. There wasn't much on the table there, but what is your take?
Well, President Trump had pretty measured expectations. He said all week long that he did not expect to have any kind of peace deal. At most, maybe a ceasefire. President Putin of Russia did not agree to that. I think once again proving that he's the obstacle to peace, just like he's the cause of this war, having launched the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in the first place. But it's clear, Mark, from the way President Trump interacted with President Putin today, if you contrast it to the way President Biden and President Putin interacted 4 years ago, that we have a president that's once again respected and at some level feared by Vladimir Putin. It's not a coincidence, for instance, Mark, that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine when Barack Obama was president, when Joe Biden was president, but not when Donald Trump was, as Putin himself said today. President Trump has said that they laid the groundwork for some potential next steps. I think if those involve sitting down with both President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia, that maybe could lead to a ceasefire. But to do so, President Trump is going to continue to support Ukraine by providing weapons to NATO that can provide them to Ukraine. And I think keeping the threat of sanctions over the head of Russia as well. The only way I believe you'll ever get President Putin to reach a negotiated settlement is if he believes he has more risk on the battlefield and to his economy by continuing the war than the risk he faces at the negotiating table.
Do you find it interesting? You've been around a while, so there haven't been any leaks of any kind so far? I assume when he starts, or they start briefing NATO and Zelensky and Russia wants to spin, it won't be long until we see some of that? Or what's your take on that?
Yeah, and Mark, you could also see official readouts once they're back on Air Force One. I believe they plan to fly back to Washington in very short order and land in the middle of the night. I would expect President Trump may come speak to reporters, as he often does on Air Force One, as he did briefly on the way there, to give a little bit more color on what happened and what they discussed. It's clear, though, that I think President Trump drew the line where he said he would. He wasn't going to try to negotiate a peace settlement. He certainly wasn't going to try to swap away Ukrainian land or making the other concessions without President Zelensky involved and the European leaders engaged. And that's exactly what happened. Maybe President Putin thought he'd be able to play President Trump like a fiddle the way he did Joe Biden, but he obviously had another thing coming.
Mm-hmm. So it's pretty clear then you think there's going to be a second meeting, right?
I would assume so, Mark. I mean, if there's not, President Trump has been pretty clear that he plans to impose what he calls severe consequences. And the most severe consequence that we haven't imposed yet are sanctions, and especially secondary sanctions on Russia's oil exports. Russia is still exporting a lot of oil to countries like India and like China. That export revenue is what funds, in no small part, their war machine. So we still have a lot of different levers to pull. Russia doesn't have that much leverage left. So if Vladimir Putin is not willing to continue negotiations and ultimately sit down with President Zelensky in direct talks, then I think that you can expect those severe consequences to be imposed. I support that, and the large majority of the Senate, even Democrats, for once, support President Trump doing that.
Mm-hmm. If you were interviewing Donald Trump, because Sean's interviewed him and that's going to be played, or interviewing him at 9 tonight Eastern time, and you know he can't answer certain questions, obviously, what would you want to know about this meeting?
Yeah, I probably would just want to ask him what he thinks the next steps are and how serious Vladimir Putin is about any kind of peace agreement. Again, I don't think Vladimir Putin would reach a peace agreement out of the goodness of his heart. This is a man who continuously is bombing apartment buildings and killing women and children. But I do think that with enough leverage and pressure applied to Russia, that Putin would be willing to sit down. If he thinks that he faces greater risk on the battlefield than he does at the negotiating table, he'd be willing to sit down. And for all we know, Mark, it may have been President Trump's plan to lay out those consequences to him today in direct face-to-face conversation. That's something, no matter how good a job Steve Witkoff or Marco Rubio or Scott Bessent are doing, you can really only do in a direct one-on-one head-of-state conversation. So you make sure that foreign leader understands that you mean business. And I think if there's anything that we know about Donald Trump after watching him for 10 years and watching him in his first year back in office, in Gaza or with Iran is that when he says something, he means business. But he may have had to get that across to Vladimir Putin today.
Do you think some of this will depend on what Putin does in the next few days or weeks militarily with Ukraine? Do you think that'll matter?
Yeah, obviously, Mark. I mean, negotiations are affected by the battlefield realities. There's been some progress on Russia's front, but there's also some assessments that that progress is very tenuous and may even be opening up their flanks to Ukrainian counterattack. This is all, again, though, kind of a tactical level progress or retrograde. There's no major strategic breakthroughs for almost 3 years now in Ukraine. So I don't expect there will be a huge amount of difference on the battlefield, but you can never rule it out.
But do you think Donald Trump will see if they're still pounding away at Kiev and these areas and so forth over the next few days? Because remember, whatever was discussed, he's taking back to NATO, he's taking back to Zelensky, and if Putin just keeps pounding and pounding and pounding the people there, I don't think NATO and Zelensky are going to be incredibly open-minded. Do you?
No, Mark, and I don't think President Trump is either. And for that matter, Mark, neither is the First Lady. I think you recall the president saying a few weeks ago that he'll have a phone call with Vladimir Putin. It'll go so great, and he'll use all these perfect words. And then he goes and he tells his wife, and the First Lady says, "Oh, really?" Because he just shot up another apartment building in Kyiv. Mm-hmm. So putting aside the relatively modest progress on either side on the front lines in the east, if Russia continues these atrocious assaults on civilians in Ukraine, then no, I think you could see an even accelerated level of support for Ukraine's military via NATO and sanctions on Russia. I think that ball is really in Vladimir Putin's court because it's clear that President Trump and, as he himself said, the First Lady have had it with that.
I can't imagine the inner circle is going to tolerate this forever. I mean, they've had 1 million casualties. Their military's been beaten up hugely. Their economy is almost on its back. You're going to have to rely on North Korean soldiers that aren't trained or are being gobbled up on the front lines. I mean, how much longer can this go on?
Yeah, it is really straining Russia. I don't think we can ever underestimate Vladimir Putin's appetite for Ukraine, but there are deep internal strains inside of Russia because of this war.
All right, Senator, thank you for taking some time. God bless you.